Welcome back, guys. In this video, I'm going to show you some best practices of what to do when you are track prepping your car. Whether it's a car, a motorcycle, or a truck, all of these basics can be applied the same. Now, what's important is, yes, your fluid should be clean and clear, but also having the right application is just as important. So I'm going to cover those basics here for you guys. Typically, my approach to track prepping my cars are all the same, but with this being just about 5,000 miles, these are some of the things I chose to address. For those of you that don't know, the GR86 and the BRZ twins, they have the capability of pulling CAN bus data and you can read all the vitals, but there is one sensor that it's missing, ironically, is the oil pressure sensor. It doesn't have a sensor, but it has a switch, which basically tells you when it flips on when there's no more oil pressure, and at that point it's way too late. So anyway, this is the harness that I picked up from Ansix Auto. That's a CAN bus harness, and that's the oil pressure sensor. And it's just like OEM, plug and play in the same OEM location. And what I'm going to show you next is basically the race box, which you're able to plug in your OBD2 reader into so that you can actually retrieve this data and save it on an app. In my particular case, I'm using Race Chrono for the app. Over the years, I've tried a variety of different types of fluids, but when it comes to braking and clutching, I prefer endless. The reason is because a lot of the .4 and .5 products out there, they don't retain moisture very well. And that basically gives you a squishy pedal, and you have less clutch and brake efficiency. So endless has a special blend of fluid to where, one, it can retain the moisture, two, because of the special blend, it actually prevents corrosion, and then you're no longer getting that weird squishy pedal. So especially when you're on track, you definitely want to make sure that you have braking power and the ability to shift gears properly. My go-to for engine oil and filter is AMSOIL. I spent a lot of hours researching different types of fluids and different types of filters, and what it's come down to is AMSOIL is the best product for me because it does many things really well. But number one for me is protection. When it comes to manual transmissions and differentials, I like Motul. It does a really good job for both street and especially on track because it does manage those temperatures well while getting the protection that you need when you're banging those gears. Now, unlike engines, these don't have filters in them, so transmissions and differentials, the fluids break down just the same, and so since there's no way to really collect the contaminants, you should change them much more frequently. When it comes to intervals when changing your oil between track days, I don't like to go past more than 2 track days. So I will drain and refill my engine oil, change the filter. I'll also do the same for the transmission and also for the differential. Because like I mentioned earlier, the differentials and the manual transmissions, they don't have any ways to filter out the contaminants and also shavings that you encounter while driving the car hard. So it's cheap insurance and it's easy preventative maintenance to just go ahead and change the fluids early. And that way your car's performing at its best all the time. So with endless fluid, the interval change that I do with the clutch and the brake is basically maybe once every season. Every season, I typically mean like 10 to 12 track days in a year. Now, if you don't track as often, you probably can get away with it, but also your environmental differences can vary. So depending on how much moisture you're exposed to, will probably determine how much sooner you should change your fluid. So for those that own the twins with the performance package, on these brake systems, there's actually 2 bleeder screws on the front caliper and then 1 bleeder screw on the rear caliper. So just make sure if you're doing it yourself, make sure you address the front calipers on both sides and then bleed it accordingly. So I actually do not have a lot of tools at home. So here at Moto IQ, they definitely have all the equipment needed, and they actually have a pressurized tool to be able to bleed your brake system properly, which makes it easier because it prevents the possibility of having air bubbles in the system. As you saw earlier, we sucked out the old fluid and now pouring in the new fluid in the reservoir. So that once we start bleeding the system, it'll actually start pulling in the fresh fluid. As you can see, it's draining here. Just make sure that when you are doing it yourself, don't drain it too far to where you start to suck in air. Some cars have a specific bleeding sequence, so make sure you know what sequence that is before you start bleeding. On this car's clutch system, the master cylinder and the slave cylinder are within a foot of each other right up top, which is super easy for bleeding. We approach the clutch system the same by sucking out the old fluid, pouring in the new fluid, and then just bleeding it. Here's our sad OEM pressure switch for oil, and we're going to put in a real oil pressure sensor with this kit. Below the oil filter, you can see that's where the new sensor sits. It screws right into where the old switch was. So ideally with this kit, you can actually wire it in your engine bay to run into the interior. And what we did was basically we just tried to follow the best we could the OEM harness that was already there. And as you can see, there's that line. It's just following the harness that's already there. We just kind of tucked it in with it and then followed it. That's the AC compressor going past underneath the intake manifold. So it's going to go underneath the manifold, come out the other side, and then continue following that harness on the back side, going from the driver's side to the passenger side. It's a little difficult to see. There's a lot of things crammed back there, but we just followed the rest of that harness and then went along back side of the intake manifold onto the passenger side. Once it comes over to the passenger side, there was a plug in the firewall that we saw, so we just removed the original plug, and there's a grommet that was in line with this harness, and you could see right there. Once you remove the glove box, then you can kind of fish for the harness, and then you'll see it pop out on the other side right there. And then you can mount your race box accordingly. I had it mounted inside the glove box, but you can do it however you'd like. Later on, I realized that I couldn't close the glove box with my owner's manual. So make sure you have enough line feeding in so that you can move that and set it however you want. Once we knew everything worked, we went ahead and just wrapped it up, tucked it in, and just covered it so it wouldn't be exposed to any moisture that's possibly in the engine bay. I hope this video serves you guys well, so stay tuned for some track updates as I'm going to upload some in the future. Thanks for watching, guys.